afterwards and you say, well, did you think of the material? They say, well, yeah, but they had 3 or 4 clean ones that had the effect.
Right.
So that's something that happens sometimes. But part of the protocol now is that we want to get them to focus on something that takes them away from the disturbing material.
Right.
And so we call that the positive engaging focus.
Right.
And the effectiveness of the technique has so much to do with how strong that positive engaging focus is.
Yes.
And how engaged they are. So that's the subtlety of it. And that's what, I think that's a lot of what people learn when they take the webinar. It's a 6-hour webinar. People say, what? How can it possibly be 6 hours? But then by the end of 6 hours, they're saying, but wait, I still have some more questions. So, I mean, we never have enough time in 6 hours.
Right.
But
and just a little aside here, I have found similar results. I'm not saying it's the same kind of thing that you do, but I call it conflict-free experience.
Yes.
And it's very similar, and as what I have found over and over again is if the conflict-free experience is strong enough, if the person is really embodying it, the trauma or whatever is left of the trauma just shifts by itself. It's amazing.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we're talking about the same phenomenon.
Same phenomenon. I mean, the critical ingredient is, I don't remember whether I talked about this at the beginning or the end of our process, but you can always edit it out if I talked about it twice.
Okay.
But there's a study by Paul Siegel and his colleagues on spider phobia, and he showed he had a control group and a treatment group, and he showed the treatment group a blank screen and had them focus on it, and he flashed the image of a spider on the screen, and he did it so fast that they didn't know they had seen a spider.
Wow.
And then the control group, he did the same thing, but he flashed it slower, so they really saw the spider. Yeah. And he published about 6 papers at this point.
Great.
on this phenomenon. He found that the treatment effects from people who didn't know they'd seen the spider were way greater than the ones who actually saw the spider.
Right.
So there was exposure for both groups, and the ones that saw the spider had the typical results from relatively brief exposure experience.
Yeah.
And the ones who didn't know they'd seen the spider had a significant improvement in their phobia. And he was measuring the phobia in a very clever way. He had a jar with a spider in it in another room, and the question was, how close can you get to that jar?
Right.
And so it's very, very,
very interesting.
A lot of people couldn't get into the room; they couldn't pass the threshold.
Exactly.
But then after they were treated in this way, a lot of them then could go into the room. Big changes.
Wow.
So, and then in one of the studies, he did a 1-year follow-up, and the results had held for that year.
That's great.
So, very interesting. But the thing that interests me most is that one of his studies, he used MRI. And he looked at what parts of the brain were becoming activated, and he found there's 2 parts of the brain, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex and ventral medial prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
These parts of the brain are essential to processing of things like fear.
Yeah.
So it turns out that if you have a fight or flight response, most of the parts of the brain, these parts and other parts similar, become relatively inactive,
right.
Because the brain is preparing for fight or flight.
Yes.
And so it's ironic that if a person is looking at the spider, it triggers fight or flight, then those parts of the brain that the person needs to process that fear aren't available significantly.
Right.
On the other hand, he verified in a number of ways that the people who didn't know they saw the spider did not have a fight or flight response. The amygdala was not activated, and those two parts of the brain actually became very active. And then there were these significant treatment effects. So it tells me, I mean, what we're doing is not exactly the same, but we're basically doing what you described, which is that we are processing without stimulating fight or flight.
That's right. That's right. And that's very, very important because, you know, as we all know, the fight and flight response is definitely a wired in defensive response that we don't have control over. So if we can bypass that, then we're really onto something there. So I really applaud your efforts, Phil. It's just great. Let's see. I think there's one more question I want us to get to, which is the other thing I wanted to mention is pick up the word desensitization. You said earlier that there was a desensitization effect. So that might also be one of the mechanisms, right? Or not, maybe.
Yeah, no, it's a mechanism, but I mean, we posited three mechanisms.
Okay.
One of them was this subliminal processing,
right,
which is my favorite one, but still, Flash clearly meets the criteria of reconsolidation theory.
That's true.
For resolving trauma memories, causing memory reconsolidation and the memory to be stored in an altered way.
Right.
So that has to be at work.
You're right.
And there's also a working memory phenomenon similar to what people say is probably at work with EMDR, where if you tax working memory, then there's less working memory available to bring up the trauma memory in its full intensity, and so then you're basically introducing a mechanism that will titrate the memory and make it less disturbing, make it more likely that the person can then just process. But none of these things really explain the amazing speed of the Flash technique, other than this subliminal processing and Siegel's research.
Yep. I think you really have that going for you in a big way. I mean, that's because there are not many things like that.
Yeah.
There really aren't. So let's talk a little bit about how and when you introduce Flash to your clients.
Well, there's how and when I introduce it, and there's how and when we teach people to introduce it.
There you go. Why don't we talk about both?
Yeah, well, I introduce it to just about every client because Flash is so harmless. I mean, we're telling people not to think of their trauma, so they don't get terribly activated, and it's very, very rare that we don't get a huge treatment effect, so that by the time you get to treating it with some, say, EMDR, starting with phase 3, because we've done preparation, Flash being part of it. By the time you get to that, it's a piece of cake because the client has no resistance anymore to getting into it. So I don't see any downside to doing it all the time. There are rare occasions when a trauma memory comes up and I say to myself, I've seen that before, and this is how I handled it the last time, and it seemed very reliable. I think I'll do it that way this time. But what we teach people is it wouldn't hurt to do it, and